Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neat, Plausible and Wrong, show where we look at business psychology through the lens of neurodiversity. I'm Matthew, and as ever, I'm joined by Dr. Miriam. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So today's topic is resilience. This is a really interesting one for me because I've been through training ostensibly about resilience, and I've seen it talked about a lot. And I find it quite a difficult topic. I think it's often misapplied. I think it's often seen as it has a whole load of ideas wrapped up in it that I don't really agree with. I think it's based on some kind of shaky foundations in some ways. So I'm kind of looking forward to getting into this one. How about you?
Thank you, Matthew. For me, I think my relationship with that word has evolved with time. I used to embrace it like it was my second skin. I used to really love the word and being associated with it, and others being associated with it, and teaching others about it, and showing people some of the strategies they can utilize in order to improve or increase their resilience. But as time has gone on, I've realized that, like you, the way it's applied is almost weaponized, and it's become something that almost has a dirty ring to it when I hear it. I am usually suspicious when I hear that word. I don't take it at face value because I don't know that how it's applied is the way I would have thought about it in its purest form.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I really resonate with that idea of feeling resilience as a badge of pride and then later on reevaluating what that meant.
Yeah.
So to start with, let's talk about what we actually mean by resilience. How is it showing up for you? How do you see the word used in the workplace?
Perhaps if I talk about how it's used by different groups, because when some people talk about it, perhaps they talk about it in its purest form, which is talking about our capacity to adapt, to recover, to grow through adversity, being flexible, being able to self regulate, and finding meaning after difficulty. That's perhaps in its purest form. But how I've seen it being used is far from that, where it's talked about in terms of how much can you push yourself beyond what is normal? How much can we exploit your ability to continue to break within yourself, but giving us what is required? So the exploitation bit of it is what I see often nowadays when resilience is talked about.
Yeah, I feel like that ability to cope with less than optimal circumstances, significantly less than optimal circumstances, and yet to carry on feels like a big way that resilience is spoken about, is used in the business world. I think it's interesting. It's also something I see as quite often in personal development or workplace development products, that they often, like, resilience is often one of the outcomes that they offer. And I've also seen this in, I think there's something around, and I often see this in mental health interventions, things like mindfulness. And I think there's something really uncomfortable for me about particularly selling these kind of interventions to really increase someone's capacity for suffering rather than addressing the fundamental causes of that suffering.
Yeah.
And that feels like the way when we say resilience, what we mean is capacity to put up with stuff in the workplace. And I think what's difficult for me, or where I find that difficult, is, of course, there are some things we have to put up with. There are things that we live in we don't live in an ideal circumstance, in ideal circumstances, but it can be very much used as a way of continuing practices that aren't in people's individual interest, like you said, that drive people to burnout, to use up people's personal resources, exhaust people's personal resources, and can be used to shift the emphasis in where, in the way that people are where the problem is seen, to the individual instead of as a systemic thing.
Exactly. And from what you are saying, I guess I also hear resilience as something whereby how much pressure can you absorb without breaking down, without flinching? And how much can you continue without resources being put in place to support you, to help you? So it's almost as if the narrative has shifted from how do we support people to stay well through the challenges that they might be dealing with in order to be productive, to how much can you take before you fall apart? It's no longer about well-being. I think, to me, it's almost has become a badge for suffering.
Yeah, and I think there's a underlying some of the stuff around resilience is actually this almost like the reification of suffering, of difficult things, of difficulty. And you see this in the startup world all the time, and particularly in the startup world, and like very long hours cultures, and that you have to suffer for this stuff. And I think what it does is it conflates the fact that sometimes we have to do hard things with the fact that doing hard things are a good in and of themselves. And I think it's that decoupling of like, well, what's the hardest thing to do without understanding why, beyond the fact that it's hard, and that is not strategically effective. That's actually a real mistake. And I think there's an implicit mistake. There's a deep assumption there that if it is difficult to do, it is worthwhile. And that's not true. And I think that also then plays into the neurodiversity stuff of when we find something particularly difficult as an individual, then therefore what we must do is struggle incredibly hard to overcome it, instead of being able to do things in a way that suits us or do something different that we excel at.
Yeah. I quite like how you talked about how resilience almost shifts responsibility from the system to the individual. And it's almost as if the focus becomes, why are you not resilient, or be more resilient, rather than why is this environment so draining? And I think there's also this element about how resilience celebrates endurance over sustainability. So chronic overwork becomes proof of character instead of perhaps a sign that something needs to be done differently, the design needs to be changed, or systems need to be improved.
Absolutely. And we also, it would also reflect certain sorts of privilege. It embeds certain sorts of privilege. Is if you are at the top of a company and you're very well paid and you can pay to have other people do things for you, and you don't have childcare responsibilities, and you don't have any caring responsibilities, it is much, much easier to work a 60-hour week than it is for someone who is already struggling, who has to do everything, who is cooking for themselves and cleaning for themselves and has caring responsibilities. That, so there is already, you just have more capacity to be able to do these things. And very often that's framed as resilience, when it's nothing to do with resilience. It's to do with the extra capacity you have because of privilege.
Yeah. And I think on that note, it also, in terms of internal resources, it sort of hides trauma, especially for neurodivergent individuals who are often forced to mask or stretch or accommodate just to exist at work. And if you are struggling, there is this sense that you are weak. or lacking in some way and failing, which adds to the load that one is carrying internally just to be there at work, just to exist.
You said it earlier with the moral aspect of this. I think it's very moralized. Being resilient is seen as a virtue. It's seen as, and I think there's something in not unique to British culture, but highly emphasized in British culture, which is the old stiff upper lip thing, which is absolutely the kind of this idea of resilience that we endure, and that is virtuous above all else, is absolutely kind of still embedded in the way that we think about some of this stuff. So not being able to endure for whatever reason is seen as a moral failing.
Yeah. It's interesting you talked about, or you mentioned the British and stiff upper lip. I'm looking at the other end where people have been forced to be resilient. It hasn't come about as a result of being supported and then developing it. For example, underprivileged people or people who have got a lot of social characteristics that are intersecting and therefore causing a lot of or exaggerating how much they are underprivileged or oppressed. They have had to develop resilience. It's not something that has come about because they've had the support. There has not been a choice.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's the very dark side of the fact that the British stiff upper lip thing was developed as a way of exploiting a lot of people. It's part of the discourse that helped build a very exploitative empire. And I mean that at home and elsewhere. So I think there's that for me, there's something really interesting in that, though, and I think this is definitely true around neurodivergent people, and is that we sometimes mistake that we're often incredibly resilient in the sense that we are used to enduring and staying functional to a level that most people are not, simply to get by because we've had to, we've been taught to, we've not been allowed not to, and yet the fact is we're still doing it. We're doing it just to participate very often. We're doing it just to show up particularly in a workplace, like you said, that isn't adapted to us. So we're already consuming a significant amount of our capacity for resilience just to be present. And I think that's a real issue. And it can also be an issue because we get so used to dealing with that when we have a real problem, we can stay functional. We don't appear to be in the level of distress that other people would be, even though we are. And therefore we don't get help. So I think there's a real dark side of this, the way that we think about resilience and this idea of like, you shouldn't need this because you're not performing the need. And that we only get the option not to be resilient if we can either behave in ways that people associate with that particular need and perform that well, or be in circumstances that our kind of general reference person, our stereotype of what a person should be, would be in distress.
Yeah. How we expect somebody to be when they are not coping, when in actual fact neurodivergent individuals are already operating in survival mode. Then telling them to be more resilient or to continue working this way is saying try harder to be someone you are not in order to perform what you are supposed to perform and produce what you are supposed to produce. And because you appear to be coping very well, then you are coping.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? If you don't cope, then it's your moral failing. If you do cope, then it's proof that the system is fine.
Yeah.
You can't win.
You need no support. The system is fine.
Yeah.
Keep on being someone you are not, doing things that are difficult, but not telling anyone, and no one giving you any support.
Yeah.
And I think this is what contaminates that word even further.
Yes. Yes. And it's definitely used. I've seen, I think it's used that way very often for very many people, actually. This goes far beyond neurodiversity, in any kind of exploitative system that way. And I think there's also something that may be more relevant to the neurodiversity thing, or directly relevant, is one of the models I quite like of neurodivergent conditions is that of different sensitivities or different susceptibilities. And that what those actually give us is a great deal of our talents and expertise. The example I very often give is, someone who is sensitive to loud noise can use that same sensitivity to maybe be a great audio engineer because they're sensitive to sound. And so in one environment, that's a sensitivity and a susceptibility and might be perceived as a weakness, but in another, it's a strength. And there are very many of these we have if we're, and we all have a different constellation of these, but if we're neurodivergent, we probably have some quite strong ones away from the norms of this. And so I feel like one of the ways that resilience can also cause problems is when an environment is particularly bad for something we are particularly sensitive to. And then again, you get the same moral framing, and the idea that we would be differently sensitive isn't something that is accounted for in this idea. So the fact that an environment is good for one person is taken as proof that it's good for everyone.
Yeah. As you were talking about how different sensitivities sometimes give a competitive advantage or competitive edge to somebody who has got perhaps very good hearing, and they can become a very good sound engineer. You remind me of how I think resilience is linked to, or how it's deeply embodied and linked to the nervous system in terms of regulation, cortisol recovery, executive functioning. So for neurodivergent individuals with sensory sensitivities, whilst on one hand, there can be those advantages, there's also the constant hyper-arousal, isn't there? And the burnout you talked about earlier, which might arise as a result of constant resilience or being constantly in this particular heightened state. So it is a cost that is perhaps not seen because it's internal, the biological cost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and the fact that very often I've seen in many workplaces where the benefits are welcomed. It's like, great, you're sensitive, you can be expert in this, but the sensitivities that come with it are not properly accommodated. So, which is so people are expected to be able to perform without the support that performance actually really requires to be something that can be sustained.
And I guess what you are talking about there as well is resilience individual or communal, relational? Is it built just by one person finding their own way, or is it built through community, through safety, through support, rather than sheer grit?
I think that's a really good, and to start thinking about what we can still take from this idea of resilience is, if we do want to think about increasing the resilience of an organization, I completely think that's such an important question, and for me, we should think of resilience more as a function, as a systemic function rather than an individual function. So it then becomes like, how resilient is the organization, which is a function of how well supported the individuals are. So instead of, and so saying how resilient is an individual starts to be almost like a logical mistake. It's not a function of the individual, because, as we said, it's so much of an interdependent quality. So if we're putting all of the emphasis on the individual to be resilient, we're making a fundamental error in terms of where resilience actually lies.
Yeah. And I guess what I'm also thinking about is, what can systems do? What can organizations do in order to support and improve resilience? Maybe auditing the systems. Why are people breaking down? Where are they breaking down? What can be done? And as you mentioned, stopping framing it as a weakness, rather normalizing what accommodations and supports can be put in place, supporting mental health days, well-being days, and protection of energy supplies.
Yeah, and I feel like there's something really important here in terms of the breadth of activation that you need. Resilience or strength in a system very much comes from the ability to activate and then to rest and recover and then to activate. And it feels like the assumption we've had in a lot of organizations is we keep, it's like keeping tense, keep pushing, keep going. And actually, in a biological system, in a body, a tense muscle withers just as much as an unused muscle. It's the movement of the muscle that causes it to grow and become stronger. Much more than we think if you're kind of constantly tense that you'll build up muscle, but you lose it. And I think that's actually really true of resilience as well. So what we should be thinking about is, how can we increase the headroom in the organization? How can we actually down-regulate sometimes so we can up-regulate sometimes? And thinking about it as a cycle, or as a kind of sine wave, rather than something where we're like we're resilient because we're always kind of on the go. That actually reduces our capacity to deal with shocks, deal with the unexpected, deal with anything that goes over and above.
Yeah. And from what you're saying, I hear how we need to value recovery as part of productivity, where people define resilience not in terms of only being on the go, but realizing that pausing, resetting, downtime builds to long-term resilience.
Absolutely. And I think that's thinking about it's almost like, it makes me think about, the tree that a big tree over above ground can only be supported by roots. Otherwise it's going to blow over, or it's going to fall over, or it's going to run out of, it's not going to be able to get enough water to grow. So I think it's thinking about the lower and what's going on below, and the performance and the high level. And that instead of thinking about resilience as like, how can we be constantly on it, actually being, how can we almost, it's more like, preparation isn't quite the right word, but there's something around that, of that understanding that trying to be at a certain level like all the time actually isn't really possible in this kind of space.
Yeah. As we continue to talk about resilience, I'm thinking maybe we need to redefine resilience. The definition that used to be there, I think, is narrow. It needs to be widened. And we need to look at adding other elements to whatever was there. It's not just about bouncing back. and recovering, perhaps reconnecting with support, of course, of systems, reconnecting with purpose, with values, with people that are important in our lives and those that support us, and with our support systems.
Absolutely.
So that we don't need to continuously have to adapt and adapt some more to environments that rarely adapt back, especially for neurodivergent individuals.
Yeah, I think that the danger of treating all of this stuff as a de facto good is that we forget that we have needs. It's almost like that, the fact that we're afraid of having needs, or displaying that we have needs, of having a need to rest, of having a need. It's almost like we're not allowing ourselves to be human, to be biological entities. And you see this in simple things like people not eating lunch at work, and the culture around that. And we know that not eating lunch and not taking a break actually has quite a big effect, a big deleterious effect on your performance. And we know things like overwork are actually, not only do you drop off very rapidly. There's this great study of computer programmers and hours worked in a week, and they found out that over about 35 hours, our productivity starts to drop off really rapidly. And at 50 hours a week, it becomes negative. And I just love so what happens is, if you are a programmer and you are working more than 50 hours a week, you create more problems than you fix in that time over 50 hours a week. So not only is that time unproductive, it's actually actively counterproductive.
How fascinating.
And I think there's so many, these ideas of like, what do we mean by resilience? It's like, that's not resilient. That's not, I think, that idea of this as a process. And I think, you mentioned this when we were, when we were chatting before we started recording, around, thinking about it more as an active process, thinking about the whole thing, rather than as this kind of quality of just like, you've got a resilient score and you can say, I'm this resilient. It's like that isn't really how it works. And so, but for me, one of the really important things of this is actually the validation of need, our own needs. And for those of us who are sensitive to different things and have different modes of recovery and different things that get depleted, the validation of those needs. And I think, if you're neurodivergent, you're very likely to have had experiences where your distress has been invalidated, where your experiences of something being difficult or unpleasant, you've been told that you're wrong. You're not finding this difficult. You're experiencing this wrong. And that, we need to get rid of that. That's fundamentally problematic on so many levels. And I think that idea of actually affirming our own experience. It's not about stopping. It's not about being weak, but it's about the fact that the more we meet our needs, the more we can actually do. And instead of shifting this idea to resilience, for me, it's thinking in terms of, what do we need to perform? And I much prefer that, is what support do we need to perform at our best, rather than how resilient can we be, is actually a much, much better question, I think.
Yeah. When you were talking about how there becomes a cost associated with the number of hours that you work beyond a certain level, I smiled at that, and I found that quite fascinating, because what it reminds me of is how often I have seen in organizations, when people are putting in extra hours, how much that is actually applauded. When you are, for example, in the NHS, when you put in extra hours, you are not really taking much of a break, and you are going, some places even have an above and beyond or best practice kind of thing. Oh, this person is so resilient, they are doing it so well. Are they? At what cost?
And I think this is one of the things, having led teams of people, someone regularly going home late, having to work more than their hours, for me as a manager, is a problem. It either means I'm not allocating the work properly, or it means they're not handling the work properly.
Oh, they are not supported enough to do their work properly.
Which means, yes, and then which implies that they're not supported enough. They haven't been given what they need to do the work properly.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that really, that thinking of, we this idea of just more is for the sake of more. That feels like there's an assumption underneath all of this. It's just like, yes, more hours, more work, more. It's like, we need to be clear about why. We need to make sure this is there's a positive benefit to doing more, to taking on all this stuff, and be really clear about that. And I feel like that's a big part of this, like on a strategic level, on an organizational level, and to understand the longer term is that if we're regularly kind of going over capacity, we're actually running a risk as well, because the more resilient we're asking people to be, the closer to their functional limit, that if something happens that pushes people over that limit that we didn't predict, we go into failure very quickly. And I think that's the other thing. It's like, it's like if your normal operating conditions are one of struggle and resilience, then you have a problem, because as soon as you step out of those normal operating conditions, which happens because reality is a complex, messy, and unpredictable thing, then you're immediately massively over capacity.
Yeah. When you mentioned that for you as a manager, someone going home late almost every time is a problem, is a red flag for you. I wonder whether KPIs are a problem in terms of what they cover, because a lot of managers look at, are you meeting your KPIs? It doesn't matter what you are utilizing as resources, external or internal, or extra time of your own, and what that might be doing to you. And I do think what they look at is, as long as you are able to meet your KPIs, the deadlines, then they use you as an example of somebody who is going above and beyond, someone who's very productive, someone who is doing it well, someone who has got it all together.
That is, I kind of agree, but that is until the point at which, and again, this is a kind of slightly IT story, is that there are very many stories from IT of people who have given a set of work and then automate it and then do very little, because they have approached it in a clever way and they've solved a problem, and the organization is based on this idea of these very fixed ideas of amount of work. And so they just run it's like this thing that everyone else has been doing manually. They create a script for, they create a little program for, and then it does it all automatically, and they just watch it, pick up any errors, and in half an hour they've done all of their day's work. That is also not often taken terribly well. And I think there's this relates to this idea of almost being busy for its own sake. But I don't want to go too much into that, because I feel like that we're actually crossing over. So I want to wrap up today, because we're almost starting to talk about the topic we're going to talk about next week. So so in terms of resilience, though, how would you sum this up? For where would you, if someone's thinking about resilience as an idea and thinking yes, how would you suggest they approach it?
I think from everything we have said, how I would encourage people to approach it is, resilience isn't about bouncing back at all cost. It's about, especially for systems, building the kind of workplaces where people don't have to break down in the first place, especially those who already carry more invisible weight just to stay afloat. And as a manager, as a leader, you would know your team. You would know who might need more. Well, I would hope one would know who needs more support, or your door would be open enough for somebody to feel able, to feel safe to say what their needs are in order to get the support that will allow them to stay able, not just afloat, and come out of the survival mode.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that idea, survival mode, really captures it for me, the way that so many organizations and individuals are permanently in survival mode. No, I think that's such an important thing, and it's quite a fundamental way to the way we think of running organizations very often, and also the way we think about efficient organizations. So yeah, I hope everyone out there really found that useful, maybe somewhat validating in terms of your own experience. And we'd really appreciate it if you do have anything, please do share with us. Any questions, if you ask them. We're going to do a wrap-up episode of questions once we've actually got all of these episodes released, so we can answer everything. Our next episode is going to be on productivity. As you might have caught, we were kind of almost going in that direction already, but I think this push to productivity is something that's a really significant barrier in a way. It's a strange thing that more productivity is not necessarily good or better. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that one. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye.